Have you ever thought about the impact that Christianity has had on our perception of history? Especially when you consider that history is not the past, it's what survives. I did a video last year, What Happened When Christianity Came to Power Last Time, where I shared some serious concerns about Christianity's rise to power that often doesn't get explored in conversation, such as the fragility of much of Christian history prior to Emperor Theodosius I and the near immediate descent of the Western Roman Empire into the Dark Ages after Christianity comes into power. I'll link the video and the study guide for that one in the description. And while I'm not going to revisit the details from that video today, today's conversation is basically the continuation of the subject. My concluding thought then was this. In just 100 years, Christianity helped collapse an empire 1,200 years in the making and plunge Europe into nearly a millennium of darkness from 476 to 1453. And because that history was suppressed before the fall, Christianity, the culprit, emerged from the wreckage with clean hands. And so in today's conversation, we're talking about what Christianity did to history. Wherever Christianity gained control of cultural institutions, it often gained control over what could be remembered, what would be forgotten, and what could be inserted into the historical record as though it had always been there. The archive was not merely lost, it was curated. We often imagine history as everything that happened in the past. In practice, history is what survived, what was written down, what escaped destruction, what someone continued copying, what institutions considered worth preserving, and what later authorities permitted people to read. Once Christian authorities became intertwined with imperial and political power, Christianity was no longer simply one religious voice contributing to the archive. It increasingly became one of the institutions deciding what the archive would contain. Let's start this conversation with physical destruction. There were direct attacks upon temples, statues, sacred objects, and written works associated with rival religions. Late antique sources and archaeological evidence document Christians destroying or mutilating temples, synagogues, cult images, and other religious spaces. Now, this wasn't just vandalism. This was the alteration of the historical record. The destruction of the Serapeum of Alexandria in 391 Common Era is one of the most pivotal and symbolic moments of late antiquity. It marked a dramatic turning point where Christianity transitioned from a newly tolerated faith into the aggressive, dominant state religion of the Roman Empire, effectively dismantling the public heart of pluralism in Egypt. The catalyst for the violence was orchestrated by Theophilus, the bishop of Alexandria. After gaining control of an old pagan sanctuary, he uncovered sacred cult objects and paraded them mockingly through the streets of Alexandria to public ridicule. This led to riots in the streets and a standoff between the pagans and the Christians. To resolve the standoff, Emperor Theodosius I issued an imperial decree that granted a pardon to the pagans to reduce the bloodshed, but ordered the temple to be destroyed to eradicate the root of the religious conflict. The Serapeum's branch library, which held scroll collections left over from or complementing the main library of Alexandria, was looted and destroyed during the sack, marking one of the final blows to Alexandria's classical collection. Historian Dirk Roman argues that the surviving evidence, especially Orosius, supports the conclusion that the Christian mob destroyed a functioning library that had succeeded the original Ptolemaic collection. If he's correct, that could represent a loss of as many as 42,000 unique works destroyed in 391. Even if several thousand scrolls survived, the historical loss would have still been disproportionate. Just one unique copy of a historian, philosopher, dramatist, physician, or critic might represent an entire intellectual tradition now known only through references or quotations, or even worse, lost to history altogether. But that's just one incident. The truth is that Christian emperors often prohibited and ordered the destruction of certain writings. Porphyry's 15-volume Against the Christian, one of antiquity's most substantial philosophical criticisms of Christianity, survives only in fragments quoted by the Christians who answered him. Stop and think about that one. We only know what he said because Christians couldn't stop themselves from talking about him. Imperial orders under Christian rulers called for all copies of his work to be burned. Written in the late 3rd century, Against the Christians was arguably the most dangerous intellectual assault Christianity faced in late antiquity. Unlike earlier anti-Christian writers who relied on crude rumors or general philosophical disdain, his writings brought serious philological, historical, and textual criticism to the debate. He attacked the Christian scriptures from the inside, pointing out internal contradictions, historical inaccuracies, and philosophical flaws. By the early 330s, Constantine was allegedly publicly celebrating the destruction of Porphyry's anti-Christian writings and using it as the precedent for ordering the books of Arius burned. An earlier Constantinian order against Porphyry is generally inferred, sometimes dated around 325, although its exact date and time have not survived. And I do tend to be highly suspicious of stories that ambiguously relate Constantine to Christianity in ways that find no support in the historical context and seem to only serve the purpose of borrowing authority. But that's another conversation. Subsequent Christian emperors, including Theodosius II and Valentinian III in 448 Common Era, issued strict edicts mandating the complete destruction of all copies of Against the Christians. The suppression was so thorough that no complete copy of the 15-volume work survives today. His work represents a pivotal bridge between late pagan antiquity and early church history. His historical critical method, particularly his analysis of Daniel, was so sharp that modern biblical scholarship largely confirmed his conclusions about the text over 1,500 years later. Consider the ramifications of that. Someone 1,500 years ago had enough good sense to call a spade, and modern scholarship is just now catching up to a 1,500-year-old conclusion. His writings forced early Christian scholars to refine their theology, develop sophisticated biblical hermeneutics, and directly engage with classical Greco-Roman philosophy. Dirk Roman's study of late antique censorship documents the participation of Christian emperors, authorities, and theologians in suppressing texts considered heretical, magical, pagan, or otherwise dangerous. This means we frequently know Christianity's ancient critics only through the responses written against him. The defense survived. Most of the prosecution's case, unfortunately, did not. Okay, so we're still talking about what Christianity did to history. Now let's discuss destruction through neglect. The more subtle form of destruction was simply refusing to reproduce something. Before printing, a work survived only if generations of scribes continued investing time, labor, and expensive materials into copying it. A text didn't have to be publicly burned to disappear. It only had to become unworthy of copying. As Christian institutions came to dominate much of European literary production, Christian scribes and patrons increasingly determined which portions of classical culture would cross the divide between antiquity and the medieval world. Christian copyists certainly preserved important non Christian works, but preservation was selective and shaped by religious, educational, and ideological priorities. The same institutional network that rescued many classical texts also possessed enormous power to determine which text would quietly die. Christian institutions preserved part of the ancient world after helping decide which parts of that world deserved preservation, which is a nice segue into the destruction of competing Christian histories. Christianity didn't merely suppress pagan memory. Victorious Christian factions also suppressed competing versions of Christianity. Early Christianity was not originally the unified movement that later church historians often present. There were disagreements about Jesus, resurrection, salvation, scripture, sexuality, and even the ritual and nature of God. The eventual winners called themselves Orthodox and labeled their competitors heretics, creating the impression that orthodoxy had always been the original center, while every other form was a later corruption. Canon formation was one component of that consolidation. Athanasius' Festal letter of 367 contains the earliest surviving list that corresponds precisely to the present 27-book New Testament. It distinguished approved books from writings Christians were not to treat as authoritative. The eventual canon preserved one collection of early Christian voices while pushing many others outside the boundaries of legitimate Christian memory. The result was not only theological exclusion, it was historical distortion. Once alternative texts disappeared, later Christians could look backward and imagine a much more unified beginning than had actually existed. For example, the Gospel of Peter offered an alternative account of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. In it, Jesus remained silent on the cross as though he felt no pain, language that some church leaders associated with docetism, the belief that Jesus only appeared to possess a fully human body and therefore didn't truly suffer. But there's also the Gospel of Thomas. It contained 114 sayings attributed to Jesus rather than a narrative of his ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection. It presented itself as a collection of hidden sayings and opened by declaring that whoever discovered their correct interpretation would escape death. There was also the Gospel of Judas, which offered a radically different portrayal of the disciple remembered as Jesus' betrayer. Irenaeus reported that Christians he identified as Cainites believed Judas alone understood the truth and that his betrayal helped accomplish a hidden divine mystery. And there's the even lesser known Gospel of Truth. It was associated with Valentinian Christians, and it presented salvation primarily as deliverance from ignorance through knowledge of the Divine Father. By the 4th century, Eusebius could place the Gospels of Peter, Thomas, and Matthias, along with the Acts of Andrew and John, into an entirely separate category from books that were merely disputed or excluded. He didn't simply describe them as non canonical, he described them as heretical fabrications unworthy of Christian consideration. The result was that these writings ceased to function as competing witnesses to early Christian diversity. They became false gospels, while the writings selected by the victorious tradition became the authoritative record of what Christianity had supposedly always been. The victors didn't simply win the argument, they inherited the authority to describe what the argument had even been. Our next stop is a bit of a tricky one. Destroy the record, then describe the people yourself. This pattern becomes even clearer under Christian colonialism. Missionaries and colonial authorities frequently classified indigenous religions as idolatry, superstition, or demonic deception. Their sacred objects and records could therefore be destroyed as an act of spiritual purification. Christian writers then produced many of the surviving descriptions of the very cultures their institutions were attempting to eliminate. The Maya manuscripts burned under Franciscan Bishop Diego de Landa offer an especially devastating example. A Smithsonian source notes that Maya books existed in considerable numbers at the time of conquest, that missionaries destroyed many of them, and that de Landa alone burned 27 indigenous codices. These manuscripts contain knowledge of Maya history, religion, astronomy, chronology, and social life. The irony is severe. De Landa later wrote extensively about Maya culture, making his account historically valuable. He helped destroy Maya people's ability to explain themselves and then became one of the authorities through whom later generations attempted to understand them. I'll leave you to wrestle with that one alone. Let's move on. Forgery manufactured the history institutions needed. The disappearance of competing records created room for another practice, producing documents that supplied the past Christianity's institutions needed. And this one is one of the many reasons I reserve a healthy amount of skepticism about Western history as we've received it. Early Christian literature contains numerous works written in the names of apostles, disciples, and other authoritative figures like popes and even emperors. These texts allowed later writers to project their beliefs backward into Christianity's foundational generation. Rather than saying, "This is what our community now believes," the text could effectively say, "This is what Peter, Paul, or another apostle taught from the beginning." Bart Ehrman's scholarly work on Christian forgery argues that false authorship was widely used to give theological positions authority in disputes with pagans, Jews, and competing Christians. Ancient readers were not necessarily indifferent to the practice. Christian and non Christian critics could reject works when they believed an author had falsely claimed another person's identity. Now, that matters because pseudonymous literature did more than just win theological arguments, it created fictional evidence of continuity. A later doctrine could be made to appear apostolic. A developing hierarchy could be made to appear original. A community's present position could be transformed into the testimony of the past. The forgeries eventually become political technology. But that's not all. The practice expanded far beyond theological writings. The donation of Constantine claimed that the Roman Emperor Constantine had granted Pope Sylvester and his successors sweeping religious and political privileges. But there's a problem. It wasn't written by Constantine. It was a medieval forgery that later supported papal claims to temporal authority until Lorenzo Valla demonstrated through linguistic and historical analysis that the document could not have originated in Constantine's period. This one piece of false history persisted from the 8th century until the 15th century. The Pseudo-Isidorian decretals were another enormous collection containing forged letters attributed to early popes. By manufacturing ancient legal precedents, their creators could present later ecclesiastical protections and powers as if they had existed since Christianity's earliest centuries. Much of the corpus consists precisely of letters forged in the names of early popes. These documents reveal something larger than dishonest individuals. Forgery became a method of institutional time travel. When the present lacked sufficient authority, writers manufactured a past that authorized it. And so now we can see a pattern. Destruction and forgery work together. Christianity didn't always need to prove that its version of history was correct. It could eliminate competing records, stop reproducing rival accounts, classify alternative memories as heresy or superstition, and then produce documents that made its own developing beliefs appear ancient, unanimous, and inevitable. The process can be understood as a sequence. Destroy the rival archive, control what continues to be copied, declare the surviving collection authoritative, forge continuity where the surviving evidence is insufficient, and teach the resulting narrative as the history of what always happened. Now, that doesn't mean that every lost ancient text was destroyed by Christians, or every monk was a censor, or every pseudonymous text had the same motive, or everything preserved by the church is historically unreliable. It means that Christianity became one of history's most powerful memory making institutions, and its relationship to the past involved preservation, suppression, alteration, and fabrication at the same time. The most unsettling question is therefore not simply how much history did Christianity destroy? It's how much of what we presently call history was filtered through institutions that destroyed some voices, preserved others, and fabricated evidence to make their own authority appear older than it was. We may never be able to measure everything that was lost. That's the success of historical destruction. Eventually, even the shape of the absence becomes difficult to see. Christianity didn't merely change what people believed about God, it helped change what entire civilizations were permitted to remember about themselves. Now, honestly, this conversation isn't just about Christianity or religion, it's about humans and our habits. Christianity is an excellent case study that we can use to deconstruct societal harm, but it is not the only case study. And the goal shouldn't just to be to recognize the harm that religion causes, because that often leaves us blind to the harm that humans cause and the very real forward work that humans could be doing. And after everything we've learned about the lies we've lived in, I think it's in our best interest to question the stories we inherit and inhabit. That's why Bridge City has been in a 4-week series called Headcanon, where every Sunday we've used the principles of narrative theory and narrative awareness to better understand how our stories are formed and how we can navigate reconstructing our narratives in honesty and humility. Our community puts a lot of work into our Sunday sessions because it's a point of connection that doesn't just help us let go of what we're leaving, but also helps us grow into whatever we're discovering. After each session, the community gets together to chat about the session and share their own insights. This is your official invitation to join us this weekend for a live experience that's designed to help you connect better, build better, and live better. Or you can click the video on the screen to check out last weekend's experience. That's all I have for now. Thank you for sharing your time with me. And until next time, keep rising.